Well, hello everyone. Good evening and happy December. I'm honored to be closing out. I realize I'm actually the last Chi Hack Night presentation of the year. So that's an exciting honor as someone who's been at Chi Hack Night for a long time. So I'm with Electrify Chicago. We are a breakout group and a website that's been at Chi Hack Night for like a year and a half now. And I want to walk all of y'all through our breakout group, our project, how it got started, some of the lessons we learned along the way, and just tell you a little story about Chicago buildings. So we'll be explaining and analyzing the emissions of Chicago's biggest buildings. And I'm Viktor Köves. So first of all, who am I? I'm Victor, and I work on the web for a living, specializing in front-end development and accessibility. But I really care deeply about climate change. I'm 27, and the big climate milestones really need to happen in my lifetime, right? I think back in the day, climate change was a big thing that we talked about as being our children's generation, stuff like that. But a lot of the big targets you hear about, like 2050, you know, I hope to be around in 2050, or even maybe if I'm lucky to 2100. And my middle age and my retirement will be dramatically shaped by the actions that we take today and how we do in regards to the climate crisis. So that kind of shapes how I'm walking into this conversation and what drew me to this. So how did this all get started? How did we start Electrify Chicago? So there was a climate change breakout group here at Chi Hack Night led by Derek Eder, and I was a part of that. We were ramping off of another project called Decarb My State, and I had been reading the 2022 Chicago Climate Action Plan, which is a hefty, it's like a 100-page document. I have a nice printout back there. And it says something very interesting, which is it has this highlight of where do emissions come from in the city, and it says that 69% of Chicago's emissions come from buildings. So my immediate instinct as a civic hacker who's familiar with the Chicago Data Portal, which is an amazing resource, was to start looking around in there and see, like, is there any information about this, anything about buildings that I could use? And it turned out that there was a data source called Chicago Energy Benchmarking, and it contained electricity use, gas use, emissions, and a whole bunch of other exciting data. And so, I just opened it up and I decided to just take a look at the highest emitting buildings, or the highest greenhouse gas intensity specifically. I just sorted it and I was like, that's interesting. Oh, 1 second here. There we go. So I sorted the data by the greenhouse gas intensity, looked at the biggest building. I was like, that's strange. I recognize that building. And you very likely may not. But I went to school at the Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT, or Illinois Tech on Chicago's South Side. And that is my college gym. This is Keating Hall. It's, as a student, I found it a pretty unremarkable square gym. I didn't go to a lot, if I'm being honest. But I was like, that's a building I know and I recognize. I was very surprised to see that this was the highest greenhouse gas intensity building in the city. And just a quick caveat here, little explainer. Greenhouse gas intensity is the amount of CO2 equivalent a building emits divided by its square footage, which gives you a normalized unit of emissions. So you can think of 1 square foot of building, how much energy is it being used to heat, cool, power, all of those things for that building. So it really gives you a sense of like, okay, this isn't just based on size, this is a unit of energy per square foot. So for some comparison, I then looked at Merchandise Mart, which was Chi Hack Night's old home, and Keating's emissions were more than Merch Mart, and it had over 100 times the greenhouse gas intensity in the same year. And again, for those who might not be familiar with this other building, Merch Mart is a massive office building right at Chicago's riverfront and is 80 times the size of Keating Hall. So Keating is 53,000 square feet versus 4.2 million square feet in the case of the Merchandise Mart. And so what that means is that Keating emits as much as 3,170 average Americans, despite being only 53,000 square feet, which is only 21 times the average American home. So you have a building that's the size of 21 homes emitting as much as 3,200 Americans. And for comparison, Merch Mart is emitting, again, less than that at 4.2 million square feet, which is the size of 1,717 average homes. So I'm trying to give a little bit of context just because these numbers can be hard to contextualize. But the thing to really keep in mind here is like, this is a gym that you can just see. It's not that huge, and it's emitting a gargantuan amount of emissions, way disproportionately for what you would expect for its size. So I wanted to dig further. This was really like my moment of like, what is going on here? Like, what's in this data? And it really led me to start this project. But stepping back a bit, I was like, where did this data come from? Why does the city have this list? And that leads us into the Energy Benchmarking Ordinance, which is the originator of all this data. And so the benchmarking ordinance came about in September of 2013, when then Mayor Emanuel and the City Council adopted this ordinance. And it basically requires that buildings over 50,000 square feet report their energy use, and they verify their data accuracy every 3 years. And this is straight from their page. The law covers less than 1% of Chicago buildings, but which account for about 20% of total energy use by all buildings. So the idea is you're really focused on these big downtown buildings, or just these large multi-unit apartment buildings, whatever it may be, that are really big energy consumers. And so you can make progress that way. And the vision was really through transparency, encouraging buildings to improve, because you can see, oh, if I'm a leading science museum, this other museum is doing better than me. Maybe there's like kind of a race up. And without any extra legislation, you would expect to see some improvements. And the cool thing is, in 2017, there was even a Chi-Hack Night presentation on the ordinance. So I'm just following in the footsteps of the person before me. I forget her name. I was just looking at this, but there was a great presentation. So if you want to learn more about the benchmarking ordinance, I have the link in there. It's from 2017. I encourage you to check it out. But the ordinance, one more time. The ordinance has its limitations. There's some challenges with this. So the data is available, but it's inaccessible. And the transparency that an ordinance like this provides is really helpful, but lay people can't understand this data. And we found no journalists exploring it. Like, my immediate reaction to seeing Keating Hall as the highest greenhouse gas intensity building in the city was to see, well, surely someone's talking about this. Where's the news coverage? But there really isn't any, because pushing something up to a data portal doesn't really lead to, say, an investigative journalism investigation unless someone knows to look there. And enforcement is really lacking. So fines top out at $9,200 a year, which, if you think about it, if you're a smaller building, that might be a lot of money. But these buildings are all 50,000 square feet and over. And some of these buildings are absolutely massive. So as you can imagine, if you were, say, a Willis Tower, $9,200 is not really a big chunk of change. So we have some opinions about maybe tweaking that, because it just feels a little disproportionate for all buildings. And then the data is limited and can be quite error-filled. So we found missing energy data where emissions might not be reported, gas might not be reported. We found rapid nonsense changes where it appeared that maybe there was a extra zero added in, and you see some really weird graphs, bad building names, and more. And plus, there's no owner data. So for anyone who might be thinking, oh, okay, I can look up who owns the dirtiest buildings in Chicago, not here, you can't. Like, these buildings are very disaggregated from their ownership records. So that's where this project comes in. We have this huge wealth of data, just tons and tons of data over now almost a decade, but we want to make the data usable and accessible in a way that really will help the general public. So again, I showed a screenshot from the data portal before, but for those who aren't familiar, this is what the existing data looks like. It's a giant spreadsheet. It's a giant spreadsheet. It's not super pretty. It can be really hard to understand. There's a lot of technical units and terms, from EUI, site EUI, source EUI, GHG intensity, which we talked about before, all this kind of stuff. And so our goal is, let's make that a little nicer. And I mean, looking at this, what is a normal value? Is a GHG intensity of 5.1 good or bad? How much are these values changing over time? It's hard to see just from looking at a spreadsheet how a building's performance has changed. But also, how does a building compare to other buildings in the city? It's really hard to get that context and say, is this building better than average or worse than average? So at Electrify Chicago, we add imagery, rankings, and more. So we started just by showing some raw statistics with citywide rankings and medians, but we now have a bunch of extra stuff that really makes it come to life. So this is Merchandise Mart, the building we were talking about earlier, the very large building that emitted less than our tiny gym. And you can see that we have these historic data graphs, these lines that show you that their total emissions and their emissions intensity has been decreasing. We have imagery. We add custom images to give you some grounding if you maybe don't know the name of the building, but you've seen it. Also just makes it look a lot prettier. We have a history of the reporting compliance. So we know from the data have they been reporting every year? And we try and give them some marks there. And then we have an energy mix graph. So in this case, we can see that Merchandise Mart is mostly powered by electricity, and it takes advantage of district chilling, which is like a distributed cooling network in the city. And then it also uses 40% fossil gas, or what you might know as natural gas. And if we take a look at those closer, this shows you some of the value that we try and provide. So you can really see these are what are known as spark lines. So it's a simplified graph. We didn't want to overwhelm people with information, but you can basically see what's the highest point and the lowest point in the recorded data. So in the case of Merchmart, again, you can see their greenhouse gas intensity has almost halved in the years that they've been reporting from 2014 to 2022. So this is a really great improvement. I believe they were part of a retrofit program with the city to help drive that down, but you can see a really consistent year-over-year improvement. And same thing with their total emissions, and with some other buildings, you'll really see a deviation around COVID. Merchmart, you can see, is much more stable, and it's just a consistent downwards trend, which is really good to see. And also, they've been reporting every single year. So this is a hallmark building. They're doing all the right things. Their greenhouse gas intensity is going down. Their emissions are going down. They're reporting all the time. And they're mostly electric, which is awesome. And again, these are stats that are available for all of the buildings. So this is just trying to make that information that you saw before way easier to understand and parse. So you can just look at a building and quickly understand, like, are they going in the right direction? Have they been reporting? All those things. And then we also tag building owners. So one of the things I mentioned is that there's no context of who owns a building, how many buildings they own, any of that. So for me, for example, as a Illinois Tech alumnus, I immediately was like, are all of the Illinois Tech buildings bad, or is this one building an outlier? So what we do is we look at directories of buildings and we manually tag them to associate them all together and create these simple pages that basically let you look at all of the buildings all at once. So for example, most universities will have a list of these are our properties, but then we also tag city owners like the CHA, CPS, and other sources, which are available, I think, in the data portal elsewhere. So we try and take any source of property ownership that we have access to publicly. We're not paying money for real estate data at this point, but any public data, and we try and make it so that you can learn a bit more about these big owners. Because the cool thing is that even if, say, a university doesn't own any one big building, their total portfolio of buildings may end up being more emissions or more square footage than one tall building, right? You could own one Willis Tower, or maybe you own 20 or 30 buildings, like, say, a University of Chicago. So it's important to associate those buildings, particularly because then the ownership, the maintenance, efficiency improvements, all of those have a central stakeholder. And just to show what that looks like, so this is an individual building owner page that you can go to. So this is the Illinois Institute of Technology. And then we show this little tile, super simple, but it shows you how many buildings we've tagged. So in this case, 16 buildings, their total emissions. So Illinois Tech, their total portfolio of buildings that we've tagged, not necessarily an exhaustive list, just our tagged buildings, emitted 113,000 metric tons of CO2 in the last year of data available, and had an average GHG intensity of 59.2 kilograms CO2e per square foot. And again, for some context, the average across the city data set is 6.4 kilograms. So this is 9x the median building. So this immediately tells you, like, that one building we looked at, that one gym, that's not actually an outlier for this owner. For that university, they consistently underperform compared to their peers. And there's some context there for our architecture nerds. It's Mies van der Rohe buildings, it's lots of glass, not a lot of insulation, but also there are maintenance and efficiency questions here, right? There are ways to upgrade those buildings to be more performant. And then we also encourage activism. So this is a brand new feature that we just rolled out maybe a week ago. We now have an email this building modal. So this is a call to action at the page where if you are associated with a building, say you're a student who is in a college that has one of these buildings, or say you're a condo owner, we give you some templated language to tell you to email your building and ask them about how they're reducing emissions and what their plan is. So again, we don't get any contact information or anything like that from the city. So we can't just make it like a quick send a letter to your congressman type thing. It's more so giving people that nudge of like, hey, if you know the maintenance of your building, can you send them an email and ask them what their plan is? And yeah, shout out to Bertha for this change. But then we did some extra work. So this is all the data analysis. This is just trying to make that data more clear. But I mentioned a little bit on enforcement, and that's actually another piece of this puzzle. So Climate Realize Chicago, which is a group that I volunteer with, submitted a FOIA asking the city about their enforcement, particularly about how many fines were levied against buildings who didn't comply with their ordinance, who were not reporting. So as we saw, good buildings report all the time, but there's some buildings that haven't reported in, say, 4 or 5 years. And they should have been getting hit with $9,200 in fines. And when we asked for records of those fines being enforced, the response was there were no responsive records, or put another way, no fines were ever levied. And so we did the math. With a maximum of $9,200 of fines if you do not comply for the whole year, it's a complicated scheme. The non-compliance is based on the day, but assuming a building would not fall into compliance after the first day of fines, and multiplying by the number of instances of non-compliance that we found, 3,325, we found $30,590,000 could have been collected by the city's Commissioner of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection, who's given the responsibility for this under the original ordinance. So especially the budget is a very hot topic right now. People are talking about property tax increases. And again, this is over the course of many, many years. This is not over 1 year, but over the course of this entire program, about 10 years or so, we lost out on potentially $31 million of revenue, but also on the enforcement, the action, the data, all of those other things. So my expectation is not the city would have collected $31 million in revenue. My expectation would be maybe half that or something like that, where buildings would fall into compliance once they were made aware and once they saw that there was a penalty. But this was a huge thing, and is something that we've gotten to talk to some folks at City Hall about. And in this budget, I believe the responsibility for who's enforcing this will be moved around to the Department of Environment, but don't quote me on that. So what's been the response to the site so far? One of the most exciting things is we got featured in the DePaulia, which is DePaul's student newspaper. So Climate Reality Chicago, the group I also volunteer with, reached out to multiple universities and student groups with our data. And DePaul actually ended up responding and talked to us about some of their buildings. I am not able to say on the record what they said, particularly like they gave some reasons basically like why these buildings may be outliers of like these emissions are higher because X, Y, and Z and not behaviors on their part. But their student paper picked it up and wrote about McGowan North, which is one of their buildings that was at the time as the 14th highest emitting building per square foot. So it was really cool to see student journalists writing about this and put some heat on the administration and ask them like to really be serious about their climate plan. And Electrify Chicago was also featured at the Chicago Climate Action Museum. And if you haven't gone, plug to the Climate Action Museum. They're right downtown, I think on Riverside. And it's a beautiful museum talking about climate action. And we were featured in the Do Your Part section under how Chicagoans could learn more about their buildings and making them better. And we reached out to all these universities too that we talked about. And what did we get from most of them? Crickets. So most universities did not respond to our request for comment. A lot of them we basically said, hey, for example, with Illinois Tech, I'm an alumnus there. We reached out and said, hey, an alumnus of yours has been working on this data. We found that your performance is quite poor. Do you have plans? Do you have any comment? Anything you'd like to add? And they did not get back to us. So this is one of those things, hopefully, that if we can get this to gain some traction, I think as more attention gets brought to this issue, hopefully they will have to make a plan or respond to those comments and talk more about those buildings, because a lot of those performances are really out of the ordinary. And okay, so we've found a problem. There's these really dirty buildings. Some of them are owned by one particular university. But what do we want these buildings to do? How do they improve? Well, first of all, use less energy. And that can take a number of forms. If you have been around for a little while, you know that light bulbs have changed a lot of forms in the past 20 years, with incandescent bulbs to CFLs to now LEDs. That natural transition has dramatically decreased lighting energy use. But there's also now newer HVAC technologies like heat pumps. There's newer water heating technologies. There's insulation. There's lots of steps a building can do to use less energy, motion sensors, all sorts of things. There's people whose sole job it is to do this. There's also switching to fossil-free energy. So as we'll talk about with some other buildings, the question from an emissions perspective isn't just how much energy you use, but what is the form of the energy that you're consuming? So are you burning a ton of natural gas for all of your operations, which is how heating operates? Or are you using a lot of electricity for heating and cooling and other functions? For example, if you're a data center, they don't burn any natural gas typically, they just consume vast amounts of electricity. But that electricity comes from a grid that can be decarbonized and can be powered by renewables. And put another simpler way, it's essentially insulate and electrify. That's a very simplified version of it, but that's essentially our pitch is reduce the amount of energy you use and then switch to using electric appliances and electric technologies that then can be powered by renewable sources. And the cool thing, this is already possible. So if you recognize the buildings from my first slide, those are the iconic Marina Towers or Marina City. It's 100% electric. It's something that I didn't know until I started this project, but it is a very interesting architectural building and very unique construction, and it's quite efficient. It is under the average and is 100% electric. So all electric buildings already exist. And then I also, in my work with the 40th Ward, toured an all-electric building in Woodlawn, an all-electric new construction with Alderman Andre Vasquez. And we looked at all the different technologies that go into making such a home work. So here you can see a heat pump mini split unit on the wall, the heat pump unit on the outside. These are these amazing, super efficient heating and cooling units that move heat rather than creating it, making them super efficient. And these buildings are really well insulated. They have solar on the roof. These are really incredible homes that are quite affordable. And that's an induction range there. So that's a way of cooking without using gas. Ooh, we don't need to play that video. And there's even a net zero gym right in Oak Park. So this is a building I got to check out last week, thanks to Derek, who put on an event there. And this building, I think, opened maybe in the last year or so. And they have a bunch of explanations of how they made it net zero. And for those who might not know, a net zero building is essentially one that over the course of a year generates as much energy as it consumes. That's the typical metric. So as you can see here in that middle photo, this building is covered in solar panels. I mean, every square inch of roof they could fit solar on in the law, they did, and then they put an awning on the side with some more. And then they're incredibly efficient, really efficient glass, really well-sealed windows. And over here you can see what's known as a heat pump water heater, which is a really efficient way of heating water. So this is, like when people think about this, they might think, oh, maybe the technology exists on a small scale, but big buildings can't do this. There are all electric big buildings in Chicago today. It's 100% doable. And it's also not just new buildings. So this is the Rookery, which was built in 1888, and it's now all electric. So it went through a program called Retrofit Chicago, which is a voluntary program put on by the city where I believe they kind of help coordinate and put people in touch to take on these retrofit projects, and I believe work with ComEd to provide funding. And the Rookery really went all out. They did a lot of improvements to make their building better, including becoming all electric. You'll know, I think it's a 24% energy reduction within 3 years of joining the challenge. And there's just some notes there of retro commissioning, replacing equipment, building automation, enthalpy calculations. I don't even know what that is, and an energy audit. So like you can take this beautiful, historic, iconic building, it can still be beautiful, still be iconic, but it can be all electric and use less energy. So with some context around buildings and what the project's been doing so far, what are our future goals? What are we looking to achieve? Next up, this is our upcoming work. We've been working hard at this, is adding building grades. So even now with the different improvements we've made, it can still be really challenging to get an overall picture of, is this a building that is performing well or poorly? And an overall building grade would help kind of give a streamlined score. So for example, this is a mock-up, but we simulate that maybe with Merchmart, we'd give them a B because they're quite a large emitting building because they are large, but they have quite low intensity and have been consistently reporting. And we're tweaking these systems as we go. And this is not final, but it's kind of a mock of what we're looking for. And this is also a thing that other cities already have done. So this is not just an us thing. In New York City, this is an actual photo I took. They have building efficiency scores that buildings are required to display. So kind of like a health code letter. You can walk into a condo building and go, wait a second, that's a C building. That doesn't look any good. So there's some precedent for this too. But this really helps just make it super simple, just like high level, is this building good or bad? Which is a complicated question. And I want to be honest with that there are trade-offs you have to make, and there's tough data questions and deciding what a good building is. But it's something that I think is helpful as a starting point for people to see like, okay, this is an above average building or this is a below average building. And then we also want to hype up the good buildings. So Cameron inspired me to do a good part of this. He's here at Chi-Hackney, I believe works at the Shed. And the Shed has, if you look at it in the data portal, it has quite high emissions and it has quite high greenhouse gas intensity. But you realize when you think about it a bit that the shed is in the unique position where its job is to keep giant tanks of water at habitable temperatures for fish, including tropical fish. So as you can imagine, when the polar vortex hits and your house is a little cold, that's one thing, but heating and cooling giant tanks of water is an extremely energy intensive task, and the shed has consistently reduced their greenhouse gas intensity and their emissions. So again, if we think back to Keating per square foot, again, a gym, is emitting 4 times as much as shed aquarium. So just like to tie back there, but we want to highlight that extra information that isn't available in the data. So for example, the shed aquarium has this amazing 265 kilowatt solar system, truly gargantuan system. And they've had a 33% reduction in greenhouse gas intensity over the past 7 years that they've been reporting in this program. That's massive. But if you just see these high-level numbers, you might not understand the steps that building is taking. So we try and attach supplementary info. So in this case, the shed has a sustainability page that we link out to try and give readers more context of like, yes, this building may not be performing as well as, your average grocery store, but there's context behind that and they do take it seriously. And lastly, we want to create more analysis and reports. We're looking to try and create these high-level analyses that look at buildings overall. So that's not just one, how would I put it? We're not looking just at the individual buildings case by case, but instead we have a broader picture. And this data gets updated at an annual cadence. So there's a real opportunity for us to create an automation and have some quick reporting so that we can quickly turn around and say, okay, how are Chicago's buildings doing this year? How are the new buildings that got added? What buildings stopped reporting? So there's a lot of interesting data questions that we can explore. So, how have buildings changed over time? What types of owners have improved the most or the least? And also identifying what data might be helpful. So for instance, we talked about the shed. There's nothing in the data portal that tells you about extra features like a solar system or tells you what type of heating system a building is using. So you really just see their energy inflows and outflows, but you don't really have an understanding of what the extra things are that are going on. And we also want to get more press, of course. So we're looking to improve buildings, and that takes the work of building owners hearing about us. So I like to joke that my job is done when the president of IIT sends me an angry email, or their buildings department. But when they're upset with me about my coverage of their buildings, that means that we've done a good job at publicizing this issue and taking the data to its logical conclusion, which is like, the data should be accessible. I want every student to have that information available and be looking at that and think about, wait a second, why am I paying this exorbitant tuition to have these buildings where we're spending, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on natural gas? That's not in alignment with the institution I want to be supporting. So if you want to talk to someone about this data, we want to help. And if you want help with a specific building, anything like that, we'd encourage you to reach out. There we go. I have more takeaways. And we also want to support legislation. So the benchmarking ordinance, like we talked about, it doesn't require improvement. The real thing is that it requires reporting, but there's not a lot of requirements after that. So there are still new buildings being built that burn natural gas and burn fossil fuels in giant, giant quantities. And other cities like New York City have already paved the way with bans on new construction using gas, retrofit requirements for large buildings, basically saying, if you're a large building, you have to have, say, like this greenhouse gas intensity or this energy usage intensity. You must retrofit to meet those targets within a certain timeline. So there's really a big opportunity here in legislation that the current legislation is not going to electrify all the buildings. That's just not going to happen. So some closing thoughts to leave you with. Transparency is important. The benchmarking ordinance is awesome, but it's insufficient for change. First of all, the data wasn't really being looked at. It wasn't being covered. So you could have bad actors reporting their data, putting it all in the public and not seeing accountability. But also, even then, if it becomes more accessible, that doesn't then mean that there's requirements for them to change. It would only be through a public pressure campaign. So more legislation is really our angle. And I want to give a big thank you to our contributors. We have tons and tons of contributors, so I just picked 3 who showed up on GitHub and had profile photos, so I apologize. But Surag, who was actually in high school, I think, when he joined Electrify Chicago and is now off at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And he helped tag city buildings. He actually pulled a giant spreadsheet of CPS buildings and used some automation to tag all of those. Alex added data tests and fixed bugs and improved automation with property types. And Bertha added the new email modal that I showed off. And we have lots of more contributors who I want to thank. So thank you to all of them. And yeah, that's it. So check out and share the site. You can access it at electrifychicago.net. Again, that's ELECTRIFY Chicago.net. And thank you again to our amazing contributors. And if you want to help the project, you can join us in the climate change Slack channel to contribute. We'll have our breakout tonight. And you can connect us to journalists. So if you know someone who might be interested in telling a story about any of these buildings, we'd love to talk to you. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't mention contact your own building and electrify your own life. So if you live in a big condo building and they're not doing great, make sure you talk to them. Try and get the ball rolling so that when something happens, they're thinking about how they can electrify and make things better. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Victor. All right. So I see some questions that are coming up in the chat. So yeah, if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat here now, and we'll get to them. Hopefully, all of them over the next 15 minutes or so. So yeah, to begin with, have you tried to show cost savings for buildings who have reduced energy use?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let me see if it's in one of our tiles back here. No, I don't think I show it here, but we do have an energy estimate feature. So something we rolled out was lower on the page, you can see a building's electricity use and natural gas use, and it will actually give you a dollar figure based on average retail prices. So complexities there, but like a big building probably is not paying what you and I pay per kilowatt hour or per therm of electric and gas. But we make an average, like kind of a prediction and say if they were paying, here's how much they would pay. And that's like a ceiling. So we don't make a cost savings prediction, but we do just right now pitch like, for example, if you look at Keating Hall, you can see like it's like hundreds of thousands that we predict they might be spending in natural gas. So definitely an opportunity there where we could do some extra math and show how much they could save or how much their bills have decreased over time.
Great, great. Thank you. Sorry, I just got a notice that my internet was unstable. So hopefully it's going to work, continue to work okay. So yeah, thank you for that answer, Victor. That actually relates to a question I had as well, because it, right, since this is all part of Electrify Chicago and kind of the larger electrification movement, I was curious too, like besides cost, is there any part of your website or part of the additional work that you're doing that kind of helps buildings or helps residents, others see like, okay, those buildings that are 100% electric have these sorts of savings, whether they be cost savings or yeah, just less emissions, just better in other ways. Is there any way that you're kind of showing the benefit of electrification through this website at all?
Yeah. So we have a take action page where we kind of make that pitch and we say like, going electric will save you money, insulating saves you money, all of those things. We don't have like a strict one-to-one comparison. I think that actually might be helpful, like letting you stack up two buildings side by side. Because right now how I do that is open two windows and jump between them. So there's definitely, you can look at the site and compare buildings, but there isn't like a specific feature for that per se. I think the other challenge is that whenever you're talking about savings, you have to look long term and you have to have information about like the retrofit cost. So like the city retrofit reports may feature more of that. They may say something like this retrofit costs X million and it saved them X million each year. And so it has a payoff period of this much. But we don't even have cost data from the city. All we have is energy usage. So we can make pretty limited predictions. So I think that's one of the things that we'd like to see improved too, is like, if there was any way to get more data in this data, that would make our jobs a lot easier and would make it easier to make those pitches. But I think individual case studies are really helpful. And that's one of the things we've tried to highlight is this Retrofit Chicago program where buildings would work with the city. We've now added links to each of those reports so that if you go to a building that participated in the program, you can click into the report, read about what they did. So hopefully that's a helpful resource. So we're always trying to stack in as much data as we can feasibly add in there.
Awesome. Yes, always more data. Great. Another question from the audience here. Do on-site solar systems count to reduce net electricity consumption in this data set?
Yeah, to the best of my understanding, yes, because essentially the energy picture is like from the meter, but also I think it's noted somewhere in the data portal that it excludes, like it basically will subtract on-site generation. So a net zero building would be expected to show up as net zero. They would have zero use. The frustrating thing about that is that, it means that a building like the Shed, maybe their electricity use drops as they added solar, but we can't disaggregate that, right? So we have no context of like, was an efficiency improvement? Did they add a local power system? Whatever it may be. So it definitely is getting included, but frustratingly, that actually makes it a little bit more opaque. If they had a separate column and then we added it back in, we could then disentangle that and say like, oh, they generate half their energy from solar. We can't make any of those statements, which is a little frustrating.
Yeah, going back to the more data would be nice.
Yes, 100%. More data and better data. The accuracy is also something that we've been working on.
Cool. All right, a question about the grading system that you showed as well. What's your methodology for the grading? Are you having somebody grade them individually, or do you have some sort of formula, like using regression to grade?
Yeah, so we're working on an algorithm that basically weights different components. So we're kind of just creating our own formula. The New York City system uses Energy Star, which is like, kind of good, but can have its limitations. Um, One of the things that we want to look at is like, what is our specific angle? And ours is climate. So we want to specifically look at like emissions more so than just energy, which is what Energy Star might do. So in our mind, a building like Marina Towers, even if it's using, an average amount of energy, it's better because you could provide that energy a number of ways. And in Illinois, in Chicago in particular, a lot of that's going to be nuclear power, right? So our grading is basically going to be a combination of the emissions intensity, how much do they emit per square foot, the energy mix, where does their energy come from, what are they using, and their compliance as a last kind of subscore. So basically, even if you're a great building, if you don't report half the time, we're going to ding you for that, but maybe not as much as for your core fundamentals. So we're still working on it. One of the challenges that was revealed is that it kind of highlights when you apply grades, and you can easily filter by that, it highlights some data errors where we found buildings that may be vacant, and so they have incredibly low energy use, not really a good sustainability pitch, or buildings that just like fail to report data. So sometimes you'll see like their gas use is like maybe going down a little bit and then it goes to zero all of a sudden, but their electricity use didn't change. That doesn't really make sense from a thermodynamics sense. Like they're still heating the building, you'd expect a similar amount of energy going in. So there we can expect that they like just didn't report their gas use. So the short answer is it's complicated because there's a lot of things we're trying to disentangle, and we really want to make sure, I think one of my goals is like, if you look at that set of A buildings, that you can go, oh, these are really good buildings, and not these are buggy vacant properties, and really the B buildings are the good ones.
Yeah, so it sounds like you might be able to kind of automate some of the grading, but you'd still need, kind of the human in the middle sort of thing to double check
Yeah.
everything.
One thing I'll say there is we're working on anomaly detection. I think that's one of our big kind of blockers for that. So I think one of the things we want to do is like determine when we think data is wrong and maybe just like omit them from grading or do something else there. Because we're never going to know for sure, but there are reasonable things where you're just like, this doesn't make sense. Like if it doesn't, if like you look at it and you're like, this is nonsense, you should be able to programmatically say like, their energy use dropped in half over a year. Like that just shouldn't be possible with large buildings. Stuff like that we can detect and then hopefully try and factor into our grading and just go, we decline to give a grade.
Makes sense. Cool. Another question here. are there ways to make glass more efficient these days, like quadruple pane windows or something like that?
Yeah, there's a lot of techniques. I think more glass is genuinely the answer. I think triple paned, like the building we were in that was net zero, triple paned is like the standard. But I did just hear something about a new innovation for older buildings that is, I believe it's called vacuum sealed glass, where essentially like triple sealed glass or other types of glass, there's still air in the middle. Um, but this is like a system where they vacate the air, make it a vacuum, and that improves um, the resistance or the insulation properties of that glass. So there are definitely new techniques. And I will say like that building, that gym that I got to tour had a ton of glass and it was still net zero. That is a challenge. You normally like you would try and limit that a bit and you wouldn't go all crazy like floor to ceiling glass. You would maybe try and limit it a bit, but there's definitely opportunities now. Like I think there doesn't have to be a compromise between aesthetics and performance. And a great example of this is actually the Thompson Center. It was a very poor performing building in the past and it was a huge drain on the state coffers, which is why they want to get rid of it. And Google's now doing a gut rehab and is expected to really dramatically improve the efficiency by using more up-to-date and high quality materials.
Cool. Did you let IIT know about that as well?
Yes, I think they know. So
Okay.
I could talk on that subject for a larger length, but to the best of my knowledge, the issue is mostly that they do not care. Um, so they tout like certain climate things, and like Keating Hall, the building we talked about, actually has a bunch of solar panels on its roof. Solar panels do not offset you burning a ton of natural gas. So um, yeah, it's a little bit of a disappointing situation. But again, if you have someone who can talk to me, or if you're the IIT president watching this in the distant future and you're upset with me, great, let's talk.
Yeah, we have some thanks in the chat. So yeah, definitely want to echo those. Thank you, Victor. Um, Another question here though is if you have any social media accounts where you're calling attention to this topic.
Ooh, yes, I should have put that in there. I'm at Viktor Köves on Blue Sky, VIKTORKOVES, and I'll be putting out some of this there and probably calling out some buildings. I did do that on Twitter, and that got some traction. I no longer am on that platform really, but the cool thing is that did like catch some eyes, and some people saw some of these buildings, and we even got the attention of Angela Tovar, the head of the Department of Environment, who I met at a meeting one time, and she said, "Oh yeah, I like your tweets." So it has, you know, gotten some attention, but that's definitely something we want to work on and really hone.
Yeah, another question here on technologies you're using. What technologies are you using? AWS, Ansible, Terraform?
Ooh, nothing that fancy. So we're using Vue.js using a static site generator called Gridsome, and then a Python data processing layer behind that. So basically, because this data is relatively speaking stationary, it updates on a yearly cadence. What we do is we post-process all the data and then we can kind of bake the site, if that makes sense. So, the merch mart page that you saw today is going to be the same one a month from now. So we don't need to have a backend server that costs us money to process that. We can just compile it once, ship it off, host on Netlify, and be good to go. So I'm really happy with that stack. I think it has some limitations in terms of like we can't do any complex stuff on the live site. We can't do complex queries, but it really keeps our hosting cost to zero because it's all free services, and still allows us to do a lot of really cool stuff. Like we still have a search functionality. We can still do a lot. So it's been great. Big fan.
Cool. Yeah, not so much a question, but more of a comment. But also read it and see if maybe you have a reaction or a comment on the comment. Right, about data centers are in the news all the time lately for energy usage. I wonder if one day we could track who is burning up the most storage and computer power in the city and what is the public versus private benefit of their activity.
Yeah.
Any
Yeah, that's
thoughts?
an interesting one. And let me see if I don't know if I want to hot share, but if you go to electrifychicago.net, some of the first buildings you'll see are data centers. And that's because if you're looking at just emissions per square foot, data centers are their whole job is how many computers can you fit in a square foot? How much energy can you use to do computation? So they are like, I think there's 4 or 5 data centers in the data set that are tagged. And I think they're all in like the top 10 of buildings. So they are quite emissions intensive. However, the caveat I would say is all that is electricity. They don't burn natural gas. So there's some people who there's like some discussion about whether the emissions metrics that the city uses are accurate to Chicago's particular energy mix. Some nerdery that you can look at our GitHub to learn more about. But essentially, you can make electricity without consuming or without creating emissions or creating very, very little emissions. So data centers are one that I say we don't focus as much on, simply because there's not like those same steps also don't apply, right? Like they're already all electric. You can't insulate a data center. You can make efficiency improvements, and that's definitely something big companies do, but they also have a really strong incentive to do so. Like their whole goal is how do you spend as little on energy and make as much computing? But I think there would be a really cool opportunity to, yeah, expose more of what goes on in those data centers because it's just a black box. You would have no understanding of like, is it storage? Is it compute? Yeah, is it public, private? You have nothing. So all we see is, there's a big building, it sucks in a ton of energy, and that's about all we know. So I would definitely support more information and more data for that.
Cool. Yeah, definitely the more data. Mhm.
Always more data.
All right. One kind of follow-up question, I think, to kind of the discussion around efficiencies and different glass, multiple pane glass, triple pane glass, quadruple pane windows, and so forth. The question is, if you know like how long the seals last for those sorts of like triple pane glass, and are they really better, or other kind of seals? How well do they really work in the more energy efficient windows?
That is such a good question. I do not know. So I'm not a building science expert, but I will say, I guess I would say probably a long time. They probably need maintenance like anything. Um, but I would imagine that those can be kept up to date. I will say that's probably one of the biggest things I would highlight too is like a lot of the buildings that don't perform well, like maintenance can be a real thing. Like it's like if you have a big hole, and I think someone actually described this with Keating, is like they were like, oh, well, one of the panes of glass is broken and they just like covered it with a garbage bag. That's incredibly bad for your energy use because you're just letting air out. So I couldn't speak to like how long a specific technology might last, but I would say everything needs maintenance. The duration may vary, but it definitely like you're going to see, cost savings over the long term, particularly for these bigger buildings. So it's usually those things, almost all like more efficient technologies are you're paying more upfront, but you're saving money over the long term. It's, like LED light bulbs when they used to be more expensive, but it was like, oh, well, it lasts longer and you're cutting your electric bill. So it's the same concept applies, but unfortunately, I can't speak to the specific technical details of a specific technology, but maybe someone in the chat can or in the Slack.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think that brings us right to time. So thank you again so much, Victor, for going through Electrify Chicago and telling us a little bit more about some of the great stuff that the climate change group is doing here at Chi-Hack-Night.
Absolutely.
And with that, I will just kind of pause things for a little bit as we kind of stop the recording, and also be handing it over to Bien here, who will be taking us through the post-presentation part of the evening. So stick